I'm at the Church of St Michael in Sandakan. Now this building has particular significance in the story of the POWs because a number of the POWs were brought here on their first night in Borneo, having arrived at the harbour after a dreadful sea journey, and they spent the first night here before being moved on to the POW camp and to their eventual deaths. Now this is one of the very few buildings still remaining from the pre-war period, since the town was largely flattened by Allied bombing ahead of the liberation of Borneo at the end of World War II. And it is indeed the only remaining building which has a direct link to the POWs. Now in recent years this building has become something of a memorial to the Sandakan POWs, largely due to the efforts of the Australian historian Lynette Silver. I believe that on Anzac Day every year there's a memorial service attended by hundreds, many of whom have travelled from Australia and New Zealand. And inside there's a memorial chapel and a book listing the names of all of the deceased. There are also some wonderful stained glass windows created by the noted Australian artisan Philip Handel. Now today I'm following the route of the Death March itself, from Sandakan to Ranau. When I say I'm following the route, I'm actually driving along the nice tarmac road, but it was of course a very different proposition for the prisoners back in 1945. There wasn't in fact any established track in those days, and the Japanese asked the headmen of the various villages along the way to mark out a track for them. Now the headmen assumed that this was going to be used by the Japanese themselves, and hence they made the track as difficult as they possibly could. There were frequent detours, and you went through swampy ground which was mosquito infested and with a high incidence of malaria. And of course this merely added to the misery of the marchers, and many of them of course didn't even make it. I'm currently at a place called Tavio Hill, and here the route of the track and of the main road coincide, and it's got one of these yellow waypoint markers. I don't think you can see too much of the hill in the background because it's a little bit shrouded in mist. I'm in the village of Paginatan, which is about 40 kilometres from Ranau. Now although it's more than 200 kilometres from Sandakan along the route of the track, this is actually the first village that the marchers passed through. I guess that the various village headmen, when they were marking out the track, took care to avoid their own villages wherever possible because they didn't want unwelcome visits by the Japanese. Now this was a very important staging point on the route, and a number of groups of prisoners spent considerable time here, and I'm afraid there are a number of fatalities from various reasons. The exact number isn't known, but it was somewhere between 100 and 200. A makeshift graveyard was found down next to the river, although part of this had been washed away in floods. Now in 2010, at the inspiration of the Australian historian Lynette Silver, a small memorial was made here, and the plinth here contains one stone for every prisoner who's known to have died here. These stones were gathered from the riverbed by Australian and Malaysian school children. I'm at Quailey's Hill. This is only about 20 kilometres from Ranau, so the marchers who got this far had very nearly completed their journey. Unfortunately, it's shut, I can't get in, but I'll tell you the story nonetheless. Now, Alan Quailey was an Australian soldier, apparently tough, resolute, disciplined. He was taken prisoner after the fall of Singapore, and he was sent up to Borneo in July 1942 with the first batch of prisoners for the construction of the military airfield. He survived 3 years of hard labour and all of the mistreatment and malnutrition that the prisoners suffered in the POW camp, and he was considered one of the fittest of the prisoners, and in January 1945 he was selected to join the first group of marchers to come over here to Ranau. And they made it this far. A number of the prisoners had died en route, and he was one of these survivors. But by then they were all in appalling condition. Now, by luck, a group of prisoners managed to buy some worm-ridden pork from one of the local villagers. And that night they decided to make a stew. So they cooked the pork up with wild melon, wild tapioca and other vegetables which they'd gathered along the route. And the men were absolutely ravenous. They hadn't had proper food in months. But from the first mouthful they started to retch. Something was terribly wrong with the stew, and it was one of the vegetables they'd put in which was completely uneatable. Now Alan Quayle was absolutely distraught, and he wept tears of bitterness, and because of all of the pent-up emotions from his 3 years in captivity. The following day the march carried on, but it was clear to his friends that something was very badly wrong, and it wasn't just the beriberi that he was suffering from. And basically his spirit was broken. He trudged on for a bit and then said he wasn't going to go on any further. His friends urgently entreated him to carry on because they knew what would happen if he didn't, but he refused. He sat down at the base of a tree knowing that it was his death sentence. And sure enough, the guards who brought up the rear of the column duly murdered him. And that happened on a little hill up there behind me. After the war, his remains were recovered, they were identified, and he is buried in a named grave in the military cemetery in Labuan.